Greetings from downtown Budapest. I'm standing here along elegant Andrássy Avenue, and I'm about to walk down this street to the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, where I will meet and interview its current president, Gladden J. Pappin. Join us for this conversation. Gladden, so good to see you. Thanks for making the time.
Good to see you, Mario. Thanks for coming by.
Listen, for the benefit of our listeners, our viewers, and our readers, I'd like to basically ask you about how we met, because if I remember correctly, a little bit less than 10 years ago at an academic conference, we realized that we both shared an interest in conservative political thought, in conservative political theory, and in basically all things on the right. Is that a correct assessment of how we met?
Yes, but the key point is that we were American conservatives who met one another in Europe at a conservative conference. And that was somewhat rare in those days. There wasn't a lot of transatlantic conservative cooperation, I think.
Yeah, absolutely right. And actually, one of your assistants used the term cosmopolitan conservatism. Now, I don't know about the use of that term, but it seems to describe something that you and I have been exploring and been interested in for several years. Is that a term you recognize or will freely use?
Well, I think that there are a couple of different types of conservative traditions. And I think one thing that happened in the modern period is that the liberal international political order set itself up as the only cosmopolitan or international ideology. And it presented conservatism as something very particular, very oriented only around little communities, without an ability to step outside. Now, I think for every conservative, protecting what is one's own and helping it to flourish is key. But basically, the liberals had set up a system where we couldn't talk to one another, and conservatism was presented as so particular that we couldn't have an international dialogue, and I think that's what's begun to change.
You're describing something that I encountered when I moved to Europe about 15 or 16 years ago, where I would meet conservatives in France and then conservatives in Italy who were fighting similar battles, but then they wouldn't want to talk to each other. Things have changed. Now, several years later, now that you've been in Europe for several years, how do you think things have changed here? Are things better for those of us on the right?
Yes, I think so. First of all, the international conservative dialogue has increased a lot. There was really not that much interest from American conservatives in the European right prior to the last 10 years. And in part, that was because the nature of American politics was at a certain place, and there were perceptions about the European right that I think were inaccurate. It was typically presented as, so nationalist that it was borderline fascistic or something, was the way that the European right was usually presented. And I think, first of all, conservatives connected. They're able to see actually that they're experiencing the same problems in Europe that they are in the United States, that the liberal system or liberal politics is creating similar sets of problems. And then second, you also had a number of successful conservative governments in Europe that have lasted a long time. Obviously, we're talking today in Budapest, and the Hungarian government lasted thus far since 2010. And I think that at a certain point, really after Trump lost in 2020, the American conservatives became more interested in learning from Europe or exchanging with European conservatives. And that has really begun to change things, I think.
In May of last year, you became president of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. What was your biggest surprise when you started that position?
Well, first of all, I started spending a lot of time, not just in Europe, but a lot of time outside of Europe. And what I've felt since then, over the last year, is that the discussion and the terms of discussion within Europe and the West are becoming very, very constricted, particularly about the nature of the global political order. Outside of Europe, it's pretty clear that we're entering some kind of multipolar world order, that the Western-led unipolar order is not the only thing, and that it is, in fact, in some ways overstretched. So a lot of countries outside of Europe we don't have to get into names, I think, but a lot of countries are trying to balance their interests. They're not just acting as though the liberal unipolar post-Cold War order that's led by the United States is going to last forever. Of course, they want a good relationship with it, but there are many, many more countries that are running a kind of multi-vector foreign policy. Basically, they're becoming more realist. And so what struck me is that within Europe, the Hungarian approach is often presented very critically and is very, very far outside of the norm. But actually, from a world perspective, a lot of countries are seeing the same thing, and the ideological environment is becoming very constricted within Europe. People are very constricted in what they can say, for example, about the war, about even the nature of Western leadership. And so seeing that discussion was broader, actually outside of the West, was very striking to me. But it's also very worrisome because, of course, I want a strong Europe and I want a strong role for the Western world in the globe as a whole. And if we can't have a discussion about how the world order is changing, if we can't have a discussion about how countries are trying to balance their interests and navigate this increasing disorder, then we're going to hurt ultimately only ourselves.
So you have 6 research areas in this institution, is that correct? Or
That's
perhaps
right.
even more.
Yes.
How do you determine the priority areas for your team?
Well, so we're a research institute, and we try to figure out what's going on in the world with a very simple lens or basic framework, which is how does the world matter to Hungary, and how does Hungary matter to the world? So we want to see how events in the world are going to impact Hungary. And then we have our own approach, which we want to explain to the outside. And so that's the basic structure. So for example, we try to understand how European political events, upcoming European elections, the just changes in direction within the European Union will affect Hungary. But we also want to explain that Hungary has a vision of what a strong Europe would look like. We're not just defending our national interests, although we are firmly committed to that, but we also have a vision of what a better and stronger Europe would look like. So that's why we have a Center for a Strong Europe to try to articulate. This is often presented in the international media as though Hungary is merely a critic. It's merely an oppositional force, that the proper European thinking is going one direction and the Hungarian way of thinking is just going against that. Well, we think that Europe has made a lot of bad decisions, and we think that a better set of decisions would lead to a stronger Europe. We think that a Europe built on stronger nation states that are secure in their identities and are proud of their traditions, that are able to speak in some elements even of a common Christian language. We think that would be a better Europe, not just for Hungary, but for Europe as a whole. So these are some of the frameworks through which we try to analyze world events and explain Hungary's role in them.
So the next 8 to 10 months, I would say, are going to be especially interesting for Hungary. You have the European elections in June. Hungary assumes the presidency of the EU in July. And then, of course, there's the US elections in November. And all of these have potential impacts on Hungary, but also have present opportunities for Hungary to either assert itself or to make itself better known by other powers, other countries that may have been ignoring Hungary for a while. How do you see the remainder of this year?
Well, as you pointed out, it's basically the year of a bunch of elections, and really big ones and important ones. And I think, first of all, we'll see whether Europe begins to tilt a little bit to the right in the European Parliament. If we go by we're talking here at the beginning of April, if we go by the current polls, it looks like the European Parliament is likely to tilt a bit to the right with a swing of maybe 35 seats or something like that in the direction of the right overall. That could be very interesting. I think basically the situation of the world in the last, or the Western world in the last few years, has been that there's a kind of interregnum when it comes to the role of conservative politics on a national and international basis. If we look at polls of European people, members of European nations know that something has gone terribly wrong. They know that Europe is a declining international force. They sense it. They feel that the decisions made by European leaders in the last decade have not been in Europe's best interest.
They see it all around them.
So they see it, but it hasn't translated to the political space in every country yet. And so whatever happens in the elections, this is still the fact that there is this movement of ordinary people in Europe. We've seen it in the farmers' protests, for example. There are all these flashpoints that show there is some disconnect between the political level in Europe and the evaluation of the ordinary person. That can't last forever. There will be some switch. There will be some movement. Likely it will be a movement to the right, but there have also been left-wing sovereigntist parties that have gained power recently, in Slovakia, for example. So we're starting to see the beginning of a resorting or realignment, hopefully, of European politics. That's why I think of it as being a kind of interregnum period where, since 2016, especially in the US as well, this disjunction has emerged between the political world and the world of everyday life, and it hasn't rebalanced. When it does, it will have to move in a more sovereigntist direction. Problems like migration will have to be addressed. The lack of European competitiveness, its industrial decline will have to be addressed, and nations will have to find out what their sources of strength are. So I think that's the broad direction that things will go.
So here's something that troubles me. I think back to 2016 with Brexit and Trump, and then to all the other flashpoints, some of which you mentioned in recent years. And yet I still think that a lot of the left-wing or progressive Democrat types are not reading the handwriting on the wall. What is their problem? Why do they not see what is so apparent to me and so many others?
Well, in the US, the problem, a key part of the problem, is that it's the same generation of people. So the same people are in power. I think that basically the generation immediately after 1945 have been, with the exception of Obama, occupying the presidential level in the US since the end of the Cold War, basically, or since just after that. So this is a generation of people who are unable to change their approach. They've become very rich and very powerful, and they don't have much of an incentive. They're not looking toward the future. They're not people who are oriented toward preserving a particular political community and helping it navigate in the upcoming years. They're in a defensive position. Sometimes I call it white knuckle liberalism. Like you can tell that they're holding on to the chair, and their knuckles are getting a little bit whiter, but they're not going to change. They're going to double down. They'll find a new way to double down, but this is the problem for them, and so that's why there's such a contrast between that and countries that are trying to survive and thrive and carry their national identity and characteristics through that maze. So it will change eventually, but that generation in particular has really tried to keep a lock on things.
That's the way it seems, too. So back to Hungary for a moment. What do you think people outside of Europe, and I'm thinking primarily Americans, but also Canadians and others in the Anglosphere, can learn from Hungary? I know there's an event coming up on the Anglosphere, coincidentally, here in Budapest, perhaps this week even. But I often wonder, those countries, they're steeped in this Burkean Anglo-American tradition that, from my point of view, I think no longer is apt or suitable for the challenges of our day. So what do you think that such countries could learn or take away from Hungary, especially as it continues to have a more important role in global affairs?
Well, I think in part because of Hungary's geographical location and its particular historical trajectory, Hungary is more sensitive to upcoming trends at an early stage. So it was very early in detecting the migration problem. It was very early in detecting the demographic problem before, like the birth rate problem, before anyone was talking about it internationally, and effective in trying to respond to it. And similarly, with the changing world order, Hungary has been trying to figure out, well, can we be a Western country that is also trying to navigate this new multipolar world in an effective way? All of those are areas where Hungary has accumulated some experience early. And I think that's why you are seeing more exchange between American and Hungarian conservatives. But on the particular point that you mentioned, yes, there is room for the development of a new mindset toward government. The Hungarian government has managed to come to power in 2010, and we're sitting here in 2024, and it has built a lot of successful and popular policies such that people know that they have benefited from the conservative government. They feel secure. They see that the streets are safe. When they're thinking about their children's future, even though the economic situation has been, not easy at times since the beginning of the war, they know that there are particular points in life where the economic and benefit system will help them in a conservative manner. What happened in the US is that all of those systems, like the welfare system, were built by liberals. And so they had a very different view of what those policies should be aimed at. So it's true that in the welfare system in the 1960s, the states stepped in and replaced dads. It replaced the family. And so it was pretty natural that the conservative response to this was, well, we need to take this down, and in other spheres as well. Well, there shouldn't be a Department of Education because federal education policy is bad, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it became pretty clear in the Trump administration that the result of this was that only the liberals have been competing for these national policies and national administrative positions, et cetera, over the last 30 or 40 years. So the result hasn't been that conservatives have stopped liberal federal education policy. Rather, it's that we haven't been competing, and every single policy and administrative decision has been designed by the liberal left. So it will require a change of mindset on the right. Young people on the right are more interested in this. There's a lot of discussion groups in Washington among young staffers and things like that who are trying to come up with the playbook and the handbook for the next generation of national conservative policies in the US. So I think there too, with a change of generations on the right, we'll see more interest in fostering this good governance mentality. If the conservatives can just ask themselves that question, what will we do when we are in government? What will our version of good governance be? If they can answer that question, or even ask that question, which for many years wasn't asked, then they will be going in a good direction.
And I think that's a perfect way to end this interview, by emphasizing the importance of that question, because sooner or later we will be in power and we will have to ask that of ourselves. Thank you, Gladden. Appreciate the time.